I'm going to start by telling a story, and apologies to those of you in the audience who've already heard this story. I can see faces smiling. It's a fable, if you like. And so please imagine, we're all going to take part in it, please imagine that it's a beautiful day in early summer in Ukraine, and we've decided to go on a picnic. And we're going to go slightly outside of Kiev, or slightly outside of the area you come from, to a place we've never been before. Now this place, picture it please, it's a lovely, lovely day, and it's a place with trees, so there's shade, what we call dappled shade in England, and there's a lovely sort of grassy area to sit, and there are tables and chairs if you want them. And just at the edge of where we're going to be for our picnic, there's a river. So tell me, this is a Ukrainian picnic. What will we be eating? What will we be taking with us? You look over to the river again, and you notice there are 3 more babies coming. 3 more babies coming downstream, carried down the river, their little heads bobbing up and down. So what do you do?
Jump in again.
The same. Jump in again. Maybe 2 or 3 of you now. Form a human chain, perhaps. I mean, there are all sorts of ways. It's a terrible moment. You see these babies coming down, and you want to save them, of course. And as you're bringing these 3 babies to the shore, you look upstream, and oh my goodness, there are dozens of babies coming down. So what do?
Try to stop the river.
Try to stop the river, because it's the best example I know of working with emergency situations and trying to stem them upstream, which is what we're going to be talking about for much of today. I mean, I don't know whether this works in Ukrainian, but in the English language we talk about upstream interventions, going to the root cause, to the spring, to seeing what really is happening further upstream, which is resulting in these babies coming downstream. So people have said you build a bridge, you build a fence, you teach the babies to swim, you drain the river. I mean, there are many, many things you could do. And I would say, depending, what you need to know in order to be able to decide what your intervention is what's going on upstream. And this is, I think, the crucial part of anything I've got to say today. So, moving from our story, I'd like to use our story to illustrate the various parts of the way people think in the US and the UK about making social change and helping to resolve social problems. And let's remember that the problems we're concerned with in our professional lives are the big problems. We're talking about poverty, peace, hunger. These are huge problems that have been with us forever. And I suppose another essential part of what I'd like to say is that one of the reasons for operating upstream is that we will always have not enough money to solve these problems. So you could almost say that there's a duty, that we have a duty to use the money we have as effectively as we can. So let's start with charity. And I think I would like to call this charitable philanthropy, because as you know, the word philanthropy means brotherly love. And certainly the urge to be charitable comes from a very human feeling of wanting to help other people. I think just for purposes of time, I'll tell you myself my understanding of charity, and if you have other understandings, please challenge me later on. I understand charity to be reactive. It's the child coming down the river, you must do something. It's the homeless person on the street, you must do something. It's the tsunami or the earthquake and the people who are unhoused, and one wants to do something to help them. It's war, and one wants to help the refugees and the people who are wounded. It's a reactive, very human, and entirely worthwhile response to what you see in front of you. We always, always, always need charity. There's no doubt about it. We always want to catch that baby as it's coming downstream. But perhaps we also want to look upstream and see what we can do there. So charity is that reactive, very human, loving response that is catching the baby as it comes past. May I have the next slide, please? Strategic philanthropy. So, in contrast with charitable philanthropy, strategic philanthropy is simply using strategy. You simply think through what's going on, you analyze it, you do the research, you find out on the ground what's really happening, and then you try and approach it at the root. You try and solve it at the root. And so the responses we had to, and I had myself, to the story of the drowning babies, there's a sort of assumption that somehow the babies are falling into the river, and that perhaps we could drain the river, or we could put up a bridge, was one of my solutions, or build a fence, and that if we did that, the babies wouldn't fall into the river. It's a very, very sensible response. One of the things that I think we most do, and the philanthropists I've worked with are very, and the social entrepreneurs actually, I mean social entrepreneurs are just as guilty of this too. You say, here's the problem, I know what the answer is, without asking the people themselves who are suffering the problem what it is that they know the answer is, because they for sure know better than we do. So strategic philanthropy is that intervention upstream, the right intervention for that problem, if you can manage it. The next slide, please. Measurement. Now, it used to be in the UK and the US that measurement was something that people did at the end of a project, and they didn't really like doing it very much. It was sort of boring, you had to measure it, was it going to, what had happened, you needed to tell your funders that, it was useful to know, and it really wasn't something that people cared about. I should say that I love measurement, I love evaluation. And the reason for it is that you find out what happened. And goodness me, do you find out some surprising things. Measurement, in my view, has to be planned before the project, before you even think what the project's going to be. You need to work out how you can measure it. Because if you can't measure it, I suggest you do another project. Going back to my point about there's not enough money to solve these problems, and never will be probably, you need to make sure that the money you're spending is being spent well. And for sure, if you come up with a solution that's very large and very expansive and you think can't be measured, it will be better if you make it smaller and measure it and see whether it's working. Because very, very often, the desired outcome isn't the one you get. It might be something else useful, but it's very common for it not to be what you planned for it to be. And we'll talk about that more at the end when we get on to the theory of change. The other thing about measurement is people say, oh, I can't possibly measure that. And you can. You can measure almost anything. You can count when it's babies, how many babies you're getting out of the water. But there are all sorts of other things you can do. And what are called soft measurements are just as good. I mean, I actually prefer them. They're just as good as hard measurements. And there are all sorts of ways that have been developing for finding out how people change their emotions. For instance, you can measure the development of confidence. You can measure the development of hope. You can ask a person how much hope she has about the future on a 1 to 10 scale, before and after your intervention. You can ask her how positive she feels about the future of her children, before and after an intervention. There are all sorts of things you can do. I can see disagreeing faces in the audience, which is making me nervous.
If you understand the language.
You don't understand the language?
If you understand the language of those with whom you are talking.
Absolutely, and you must always measure in their language, always. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking here about learning from the people who are wishing to help. Everything must be done in, they know the solution, they know how to measure the solution. Just ask them. I'm sure it's the same here as anywhere else in the world. Now, outcomes are here really just to oppose them with impact. Thank you. Outcomes and impact are two things that happen at the end. Outcomes are the thing that happens immediately. The children are fished out of the river and saved. And impact is the effect it has long-term on the community. It sounds simple, it can be a bit more complicated. You don't need to use this jargon, but this is the jargon that's used, sadly. It took me a very long time to work out the difference between outcomes and impact. And I think that many of the people who use that language don't understand it. Next one, please. Social investment. Now this is very interesting to me because I gather from the materials that some of you may work with corporations who prefer to do what they call social investment rather than charity or strategic philanthropy. I think when that happens, and I've worked with corporations like that in London, I think that when that happens, they're simply using another word, another phrase for what we would call charity or strategic philanthropy. And the reason they're doing that is because it's language that fits well with their normal everyday language. So you could well have a social investment that was building a bridge or draining the river. You could well have actually a social investment that employed teams of volunteers from their charity to go there and catch the babies. Both of those could easily be described as social investment. And that's the language, as I understand it, that corporations find easier. In my terms, and I think this is the correct usage, in my terms, social investment is investing money in the bridge building company. So you're investing in a bridge building company just as you would to get a financial return, as you would in my country, but your purpose for doing it is so that the bridge builder can build that bridge to save the babies. And that's what I think social investment is. So in the field of climate change, it might well be investing in renewables, wind farms, because you will actually get a financial return, but your reason for doing it is to help people move away from fossil fuels. Okay? What's next? Social return on investment. Now this is the way of measuring which is focused on turning the outcome and the impact into financial terms. So it's used a great deal in the UK with reference to prisoners. If you can stop a prisoner going back to prison, if you can stop an ex-offender going back to prison, we have a very, very high rate of what we call recidivism, people going back and back and back to prison. And every time we have someone in prison for a year, it costs us, the taxpayer, £85,000. If you can have an intervention that spends £10 or £10,000 or £15,000 even on each person who might go back to prison and stop them from going back to prison, even though that's a very expensive strategic or charitable program, it's much cheaper than sending them back. So it's one way of explaining to the world about why it's important to do this work. We might think it's important because we don't believe people should be in prison for minor offences, or we see the effect it has on their families. But there's also a definite financial return. And you could do that with these babies. Every baby who drowns is not a baby who will grow up to support his or her family. And how much money is that costing the state? Okay? Yes, now we get to the theory of change. I think the theory of change has taken off and has a life of its own, actually, particularly in this part of the world. The theory of change is a very, very, very simple thing. It's simply a way of thinking about what you're doing and seeing whether it works. There's nothing more complicated than that. I had never heard of it until 15 years ago. And when it was explained to me, I thought, oh, well, yes, of course, that's what any good professional does in this field. But it's now taken on this importance, and I think it is very important in countries where you're not used to thinking about social change like this. All it is if, then, and then how do you know? So if we build a bridge, if we drain that river, if we educate the people upstream about about why it won't get rid of the evil spirit if they throw the babies in the water. If we do any of those things, then fewer children will drown in the river. Now that's a very good social change, because, theory of change, sorry, because you can measure it. How many children were in the river and drowned before, and how many children are in the river and drown afterwards. We hope none. So it's very simple. If you say, if we build a bridge, then more children will grow up to be functioning adults, you're in deep trouble, so to speak. Because you can build the bridge thinking that the children want to get to the other side. And the children can cross the bridge even. I mean, that's a separate point. You can build the bridge, are they going to use it? But supposing they do use it, and they get to the other side, and there's somewhere there they want to play, which is why they've been crossing the river, yes, that might help them. But supposing there are poisonous spiders on the other side, now that might intervene and prevent the children from growing up. And it would mean that your theory of change, if we put a bridge across the river, the children will grow up to be functioning adults, is false. You've got to break it down into little tiny elements to see whether each one works. So if we build a bridge, the children will cross it. That's the first one. And if they don't cross it, you might as well not have a bridge. If we build a bridge, it will stay there. That's assuming that the local people don't dismantle it and use the wood for something else. You've got all these little incremental places that you need to check and see if it's happening. And right at the beginning, you need to build in your theory of measurement. So we can talk a lot about theory of change over the next day, but that's my introduction to it. If, then, and how is it measured? So let me close by telling you this. It's very, very easy to make social change. And in the UK, social change, making social change, is often compared to an English lawn. Do you all know what a lawn is? It's the grass that we take so much care with in England. You know, some people have mountains or lakes, we have lawns. So an English lawn, all you do with an English lawn is you water it and you mow it. And you water it and you mow it. And you water it and you mow it. And you do this for 400 years. Now, it won't take you 400 years, but it's as simple as that. It needs willpower, determination, tenacity, and imagination. And I don't suppose it will happen in 1 year, but it will happen.